In the gaming industry, rebooting old franchises with a new spin is commonplace, and the Doom franchise is no exception to this. id Software went on to remake Doom with Doom 3 in 2004, and it's still one of their most ambitious games in my opinion. Unlike its predecessors, Doom 3 relied on slower paced combat, a proper storyline to follow with cutscenes, audio logs, and PDA entries, and it actually focused on scaring players as well. This decision to abandon the classic Doom formula was met with mixed reception by fans, but I personally appreciate it. Doom 3 is a very different type of Doom game, but it's still Doom in my eyes. Of course, nothing can replace classic Doom, which is why Doom 3 is a breath of fresh air. It goes for the jump scares, it revamps the monsters to give them more frightening designs, it leans into horror action rather than being, well, action like Doom 1 and 2. I can see why people might have been disappointed by this game in 2004, since it was a huge departure from what came previously, but now all these years later, Doom 3 definitely deserves to be a part of the series. When the idea of remaking Doom first came into existence at id Software, there was an internal battle within the company about whether it would be good or bad to do. I think they have every right to do whatever they want with a property, and what we got was solid, but why is the Doom remake called Doom 3 of all names? It has nothing to do with Doom 1 and 2, so maybe they should have called it Doom Resurrection or something. But oh wait, in 2009 id Software did make a game by that title. It was only available on iOS devices and it played like an on-rail shooter, using many graphical assets from Doom 3. 8 years after Doom 3's release, id Software repackaged the game for the Xbox, PlayStation 3, and PC with the Doom 3 BFG Edition. The BFG Edition was intended to show Doom to a new console audience in a tidy collection featuring Doom 1, Doom 2, and of course, Doom 3 with all of its expansions. The results were mixed, and you know how Doom 3 split the fanbase when it was released, with some people loving it and others hating it? Yeah, well, with the BFG edition, it polarized fans again, with the numerous changes it made to the game. We will explore everything about Doom 3, its expansions, and the BFG edition at some point today, dissecting what makes the game work and not work. This is the evolution of Doom 3. Going back to Doom 3's release, the graphics at the time were out of this world, and were only rivaled by Half-Life 2. Although everyone would probably agree that Half-Life 2 looks better overall, the revolutionary lighting effects and horrific atmosphere that Doom 3 displayed cannot be topped. Doom 3 looked incredible, and texture quality aside, it still holds up and is more than able to give someone a scare nowadays. Instead of having colourful maps like Doom 1 and 2, Doom 3 opted to make everything dark and forced the player to use the flashlight in order to see properly. The idea is that you would equip the flashlight to look around clearer, but then a monster would spawn in and you would have to quickly switch to a weapon to take them out. Even though the flashlight was only added into the game due to performance issues, its inclusion made Doom 3 even more iconic and memorable. The flashlight will be brought up later on when we have a conversation about the BFG edition, but can I just say that I love how this one fucking flashlight has continued to stir the pot for like 15 years at this point in the Doom 3 fanbase. Anyway, the first thing that you notice about Doom 3 is how cinematic it can be. When you boot up the game, you were introduced to the UAC and then Mars facility, and for 2004, this was quite special. Sure, you had buildings that resembled tech bases before in Doom 1 and 2, but this was the first proper look at the Union Aerospace Corporation. The game's introduction might be one of the most effective openings to any Doom game. Yes, it might not be as hard-hitting as Doom 2016, but this has its own feel. Doom 3 is more methodical with its storytelling, and while it may seem slow nowadays, you eventually pick up your equipment and all hell starts to break loose. I appreciate how the player can be as immersed in the world as they want in Doom 3, and this is carried over into the more recent Doom games. So you pick up these PDAs all throughout the game, and yes, you do need to read and listen to a few of them in order to progress, but for the most part you can totally skip them. However, if you want to dive deep into the Doom 3 lore and what the UAC is all about, then you can. And actually listening to the audio logs as you're walking through these dark corridors can be extremely immersive and eerie. Nevertheless, Hell's forces make their way over to Mars, and you start the real game experience by shooting at zombies. One of the improvements that Doom 3 made over Doom 1 and 2 was the new utility for the standard pistol. Once you got the chain gun or shotgun in the classic Doom games, then you don't really need to use the pistol ever again. That is altered in Doom 3, as picking off zombies at a safe distance can still be done rather quickly with a pistol, and it's a great way to save your machine gun or shotgun ammo for the stronger demons. Like I said in the first part of this Doom retrospective, Doom 3 is not survival horror, and you won't be hurting for ammunition or anything, but it's nice that id Software considered the pistol's use more. Also, the reloading sounds for the pistol sounds very fucking satisfying, similar to most of the other weapons in Doom 3. I mean, all of the plasma rifle sound effects are incredible as another example. Now my thoughts on Doom 3 are mixed, but almost always swing to positive. I like the game's combat loop and gunplay, with the player blasting imps at point blank range due to the shotgun's limited accuracy from a distance, bouncing revenant rockets right back at them using the plasma gun, mowing down a bunch of shotgunners and former humans with the chain gun, etc. The only enemies that I downright hate are the triads, which are these little spiders that come in swarms. If one of them lunges and gets a hit on you, your screen gets all messed up and it leaves you open for more attacks from more triads. I fucking hate these enemies, but thankfully they are the only annoying monster in Doom 3, besides maybe the Lost Soul. Regardless, I feel like the campaign stretches a bit too far and it overstays its welcome. I'm aware that the Doom 3 Xbox port alters some of its levels and even goes so far as to cut entire sections out, and I feel like the original version of the game could have used some trimming as well. I'm not saying I was ever downright bored from the campaign, but it would have helped the pacing if, I don't know, maybe one of the Delta Lab missions was cut or something. I think fondly of Doom 3, but as individual sequences rather than the whole campaign. Like when you travel outside onto the Mars terrain and you have to watch your air supply. When you encounter the Mancubus for the first time, who was actually rather tough to deal with. When the UAC scientist says that the devil is real and he built his cage. When you use the Soul Cube for the first time. When you kill the two Hell Knights, which is an homage to the Bruiser brothers in Doom 1. And directly after that, when you're on the highway to hell through the portal. There are a ton of excellent moments in Doom 3, but they start to stretch just a little bit thin over the whole campaign run. If maybe an hour or two was cut from the game, that would have made the pacing a whole lot better, and it would have ensured that people remember those iconic moments in Doom 3. One of the more underrated elements of the game is how the player can interact with computer monitors and the PDA it provides. I personally love clicking on the computers to activate keycards or to open weapon crates by typing in a numbered password, and it's another engaging part of Doom 3. The only annoying use of this mechanic is when you have to get rid of the toxic barrels using this crane, and unfortunately it reminds me of something like Duke Nukem Forever. I wish that id Software utilized this computer interaction gameplay element in more unique ways, since I absolutely loved it for the most part. So a lot of Doom 3's campaign is set on Mars, but you do get to travel to Hell for one mission, and I can unfortunately do without this one. The Lost Souls are pretty annoying to deal with, especially when I'm platforming across these floating tiles, and while Hell itself looks incredible, it's too brief to make a full impact. After this Hell level is over with, it's back to the UAC, and at this point I've kinda had it, and I want to rush to the final boss. Maybe I'm an impatient twat, but I feel like again, Doom 3 has excellent moments and areas of polish, but it ultimately runs out of intriguing locations to visit. Speaking of the final boss fight, it's obviously a cyber demon, and it's a pretty standard affair. The player needs to fuck him up with a soul cube a couple of times, and he's done. I haven't mentioned the game's story yet, and that's because I don't have much to say on it. For 2004, and even nowadays, the story was presented quite brilliantly, especially in the beginning sections of the game. The player is an unnamed Marine, and you come to find that Hell has taken over the UAC Mars facility. You were first assigned with the mission of regrouping with Bravo team so that you can send a distress signal to Earth, and then later on the player needs to acquire the Soul Cube and defeat Dr. Petruga, the game's antagonist. Petruga is a pretty compelling villain, even though he's as subtle as Emperor Palpatine, but apart from him, that little summary before is essentially all you need to be aware of when playing the game. I know there are other characters like Sergeant Kelly, who transforms into this awesome boss, Counselor Swan and his bodyguard Jack Campbell, but you don't really get invested in any of them. In fact, when I first played this game, I mistook Campbell and Sergeant Kelly as the same exact person. The only character I enjoyed seeing on screen was Dr. Petruga, but that's only because he's over the top and such an in-your-face obvious villain. A great aspect about Doom 3 is how it has a pretty deep lore if you want to dive into it using the PDA entries, not dissimilar to the codex pages in Doom 2016 or Doom Eternal. One massive pro I will give Doom 3 over both Doom 2016 and Doom Eternal is that the PDA entries have an audiobook feature, where you can actually listen to it in-game, rather than bringing up the menu, going down to the page you want, and then slowly reading it, breaking up the overall gameplay experience. id Software has handled Doom 2016 and Doom Eternal so well, but if they ever bring back the codex entries in their future Doom games, please introduce the audiobook function again from Doom 3. Anyway, Doom 3's positives outweigh its negatives for the most part. While the pacing is my main point of criticism, I cannot deny that the game's atmosphere, its lean on horror elements, and the dynamic lighting and technical leaps that it achieved in 2004 are all incredible qualities. Additionally, whenever I think about Doom 3 in my head, my thoughts typically sway to being quite positive. In 2005, Nerve Software developed the game's first expansion, titled Resurrection of Evil. I really enjoyed this expansion, even though it has some glaring issues that I'll get to later on. We play as another Marine this time, and Resurrection of Evil continues the Dr. Petruga storyline that was set up in the base game. In the first set of levels, you gain access to the expansion's new weapons, the Super Shotgun returning from Doom 2. The Grabber Gun, which does exactly what you would expect, grab enemy projectiles so you can toss it back at them, and the Artifact, which has a few different properties. As you progress through the game and kill the various Hell Hunters, which are one of the new boss mobs in the expansion, the Artifact gains more and more buffs, and it's powered by these demonic corpses on the ground in levels. The Artifact is useful to blow past the more difficult sections of the game, but it also ruins any type of atmosphere that Resurrection of Evil tries to create. I mean, the fact that you can activate the artifact to slow down time and then just murder everything in the room with the shotgun eliminates any scariness or moody tone. Apart from that little critique, which may not be a critique to you depending on what you want from Doom 3, the action or the horror, but anyway, Resurrection of Evil is a pretty solid expansion. As mentioned, the Super Shotgun returns and it's as badass as ever, but the Grabber Gun I find to be kinda useless a lot of the time. I mean, the normal arsenal in Doom 3 is good enough to take care of the demon horde, and if you couple that with the Super Shotgun, the Grabber Gun unfortunately falls by the wayside. At least there's an inventive Hellhunter boss fight in the beginning of the game that you have to use the Grabber Gun on, but nevertheless, the Grabber Gun might be the weakest new entry. The levels themselves in Resurrection of Evil are pretty damn good for the most part. sites, and I think I enjoy the expansion's version of Hell to the base game, minus the final boss. The Erebus dig site at the start is awesome to go through, as well as the Phobos labs later on in the expansion. Most of the levels don't overstay their welcome, and they even add some unique elements to Doom 3, with a prime example being the Hazmat Mancubi section in Erebus level 5. This is a tense little set piece, as you need to repeatedly grab more oxygen to stay alive, and it appears even more threatening because of a Mancubi being one of the toughest monsters in the game. In the BFG edition though, well, we'll talk about it, but people are not happy about what they changed to the expansion. The new enemies in the expansion include the Vulgar, the Bruiser, the aforementioned Hellhunter, and the Forgotten One. I question this being a new monster since it's basically the Lost Soul retextured, but whatever. Either way, the Vulgar is a new variant on the classic Imp and shoots plasma balls instead of the regular fireballs, although these are even weaker than the Imp's attacks, which I find weird. The Bruiser is basically a mini-boss, but then transitions into a regular enemy later on in the game. He basically acts like a massive tank, and feels like a combination between the Mancubus and the Hell Knight, which is cool to see. I also love the little TV monitor on him as well, as it gives him a more mechanical look. So I said that the Hell level in Resurrection of Evil might be better than the base game, but the expansion's final boss is a huge letdown. As you would expect, the final boss is Dr. Betruger, who has basically transformed into a flying dragon skeleton monster, also known as the Maledict. The boss fight comprises of two phases, one where he summons lost souls, shoots projectiles, and also a long stretch of fire. And the other phase is where a ton of fireballs come down that are pretty annoying to dodge among the other shit that the boss is throwing at you. What the player needs to do is use the artifact in order to slow down time so you have a clear window of opportunity to shoot at him. The worst part about this boss is that you have no real indication of him being damaged. So you just fire away until the ending cutscene plays abruptly. It just hard cuts without any hint of you actually beating him. Even though Resurrection of Evil is a fairly great expansion, I cannot pretend that this final boss doesn't leave a bit of a bad taste in my mouth. That being said, the ending cutscene itself is awesome, with a Marine shoving the artifact right into Betruger's fucking mouth. Oh, and the ambiguous ending is also welcomed. Dr. McNeil, who is a character that I haven't really mentioned up until now because the expansion story doesn't really interest me, but here's a quick lore dump anyway. Shameful plot synopsis aside, Resurrection of Evil's ending is up for interpretation as the screen turns white after the final boss and McNeil says, "Welcome home, Marine." Now, I personally like to think that the Marine didn't survive Dr. Betruger since he gets fucked up towards the end of their fight, but he winds up in heaven, or at least Doom 3's version of some kind of heaven. This explains why the screen is white instead of the typical black that you would see in these types of ambiguous endings, and that was the expansion. I personally get a huge kick out of playing Resurrection of Evil, and it might be a bit more enjoyable than the base game in some parts, minus the disappointing Betruger boss. Oh, and I am a massive twat for not mentioning the new arcade games that this expansion offers, like Sarge's Big Game Hunts, Helenoid, and Martian Buddy Blaster. Yes, I know they're a minor touch to the game, but I find that these give Doom 3 more personality on top of the PDAs, audio logs, and all that kind of stuff. Along with Resurrection of Evil, there was the Doom 3 BFG Edition in 2012, and it's a controversial product for sure. This was advertised as the ultimate Doom package, and the best way to play Doom 3, and people have argued about this ever since the game's launch. The most obvious changes from the original to the BFG edition are the removal of the flashlight and the brightening of each level. While the flashlight was merely a solution to hardware limitations, it also brought an intense feeling to the game. If you get jumped by a group of imps with a flashlight in hand, you have to scramble through your weapons and then battle it out. The flashlight made Doom 3 much more effective in trying to startle startle the player, but in the BFG edition you get a shoulder mounted flashlight that can be flicked on or off even when holding a weapon. This alteration, and of course making the game inherently brighter, ruined the experience in some people's eyes, and that is hard to argue with. In my personal opinion, even though I respect the flashlight and will usually just play regular Doom 3, this was a good choice for newer players coming into the game. But I will say that they should have at least had the option in the BFG edition. Another weird decision that they made with the BFG edition is that the ammo pickups provide more ammunition than in classic Doom 3. Similar to the flashlight being removed, I assume this was altered to cater to newcomers, and yeah, I shouldn't have an excess of chain gun and plasma rifle ammo laying about. This diminishes some of the game's challenge, even on higher difficulties, but I digress. An aspect of the BFG edition that I don't hear many people talk about, but I believe is a brilliant new feature, is the checkpoint system. Whenever I play Doom 3, I sometimes get so wrapped up in the gameplay that I forget to save, and when I end up dying, I have to start back from like half an hour ago. This makes me not want to continue, and even though I know it's my fault for not saving enough, the BFG edition rectifies this issue by having systematic checkpoints. Yes, I can see how this might be distracting since an obnoxious lower third pops up that says it's saving, but I think it's not a big deal compared to the alternative, which is forgetting to save and then having to spend an hour trying to get back to where you died originally. So even though the change I'm about to talk about next doesn't affect gameplay or anything like that, and we'll no doubt get to those alterations later, but anyway, the fact that they made the cutscenes unskippable really annoys me. I know that the BFG edition is more intended for new audiences and to bring all of the console gamers up to speed with Doom's legacy, but this does not mean that the cutscenes should be unskippable. It bogs down the overall experience, and the option would have been extremely welcomed. Luckily, they didn't mess up the Doom 3 campaign all that much, like everything that you would have played in the original game is here. Resurrection of Evil, on the other hand, is where we find some issues with the BFG edition though. You know that tense, toxic waste set piece in the expansion where you have to continually grab air from zombies and on the ground to survive? Yeah, well, the BFG edition removes the hazmat suit entirely, and you can just walk through the waste like normal. There are still hazmat suit zombies in this section that you can kill, but they remove the cutscene of a marine putting on the suit, and the toxic waste is no longer toxic, you can just walk through it. This negates any type of tense feeling you may have when playing, and this continues with the expansion's Hell level. In Hell, the Green Forest section with the Hell Knights, Imps and Mancubi is removed entirely. I don't know why Resurrection of Evil was tempered more than the original Doom 3, but speaking of changes, the part in Delta Labs where your surroundings are phasing in and out of Hell is gone, it's just removed entirely, which makes this level so bland by comparison. Apart from changing fundamental game mechanics and set pieces of Doom 3 and Resurrection of Evil, the BFG edition also adds its own new campaign, known as the Lost Missions. I know that this level set doesn't have many fans, but I personally like it for what it is. Yes, it shamelessly recycles locations from the original game. Yes, it doesn't utilize all of the game's monsters. Yes, it only has an episode's worth of levels and can be completed in like an hour, but I tend to think of the Lost Missions as a Doom 3 highlight reel. I've also got to say that the Lost Missions Hell level might be the best depiction of Hell that we've seen in the Doom 3 universe. I mean, there's even an open area to fight monsters in during this level, which is always great to see and quite unique from other Doom 3 material. The only disappointing part about the Lost Missions is the anticlimactic ending boss fights, but that's kind of par for the course with Doom 3 anyway. The BFG edition, in an attempt to be the ultimate Doom collection, packages in Doom 1 and 2 for good measure. These ports are not the best method of playing the original games, point blank. But I imagine in 2012, for PlayStation and Xbox owners, this was a pretty decent way to experience Doom 1 and 2. These games are not perfect by any stretch in the BFG Edition, and there are plenty of issues with them. Cheat codes don't work at all, the music and sound effects seem drowned out, the Nazi imagery in maps 31 and 32 are removed entirely, on Nightmare the monsters are not fast, the Tower of Babel is not shown being built during the intermission screens, you cannot change your control setup or rebind your keys, there are no graphical options apart from full screen on and off, and the red medkit cross is replaced by a red pill, which I actually don't mind compared to the green cross we get from the Bethesda releases. The silver lining in all of this is that at least it has no rest for the living, which for a while was only available on the Xbox Live Arcade version of Doom 2. So the BFG Edition is a mixed bag, but I don't hate it. I understand quite a few of the choices made by id Software regarding this re-release, and while I think there should have been an option for the flashlight or updating lighting for example, the BFG Edition, in my opinion, was a solid purchase for people wanting to get into the Doom franchise in 2012. In the same way that Doom 3 has evolved with the BFG Edition and subsequent releases, the fan reception of the game has also been altered. I think either way you slice it, Doom 3 will always be considered the black sheep of the series, but I do hope that its merits are talked about just as much. Of course the gameplay is not as timeless as Doom 1 and 2, that is literally impossible since Doom 3 is an entirely different game. Doom 3 has one campaign, one story it wants to tell, and if you're on board with that, you'll enjoy your time. It doesn't have the same replayability as classic Doom, but at one point, Doom 3 was the most creepy and atmospheric game out there, with its scary monster designs and unparalleled horror lighting. Looking back at the game all of these years later, Doom 3 is still a very effective experience, even when it was re-released with the BFG Edition and some of its fundamental game design elements were revoked. And this has been the evolution of Doom 3.